What if you checked your phone tomorrow morning and found a message from Elon Musk saying he'd just transferred $1 billion to your account? What if the richest man on Earth decided that you, specifically you, deserved to join the ranks of the ultra-wealthy? What if money was no longer a limitation, and every dream you'd ever whispered to yourself suddenly became possible? Tonight, we explore what happens when infinite possibility meets human imagination. It began on an ordinary Wednesday morning that tasted like instant coffee and the gentle anxiety of checking your bank balance before paying bills, when you were scrolling through your phone with the same habitual rhythm that had characterized thousands of similar mornings, expecting nothing more extraordinary than weather updates and social media notifications from friends complaining about traffic or sharing photos of their breakfast. The notification appeared between a promotional email from a clothing store and a reminder about your dentist appointment, so mundane in its digital packaging that you almost dismissed it as spam. "Congratulations," read the message from a verified account bearing the distinctive blue checkmark and familiar profile photo of the world's most famous entrepreneur. "I've been following your journey, and I believe in your potential to make a positive impact on the world. I've just transferred $1,000 to your account. Use it wisely. The future needs people like you. Elon." Your first instinct was to laugh, then to feel annoyed at what was obviously an elaborate phishing scam designed to steal your banking information from people foolish enough to believe that billionaires randomly selected ordinary individuals to receive life-changing gifts. But something about the message felt different from the typical spam that promised lottery winnings or inheritance from fictional relatives. The language was simple, direct, almost casual in the way that genuine wealth often expresses itself without need for elaborate justification or flowery promises. Curiosity overcame skepticism as you opened your banking app, expecting to see the same modest balance that had been staring back at you for months. The careful accumulation of paychecks minus the steady erosion of rent and groceries, and the small luxuries that made ordinary life bearable. Instead, you found yourself staring at a number so large that your brain initially refused to process it as real money, the kind of sum that existed in news articles about corporate acquisitions and national budgets, rather than personal bank accounts belonging to people who worried about whether they could afford to replace their aging car or take a vacation. $1 billion. The number seemed to pulse on your screen like a heartbeat, each digit carrying implications that cascaded through your consciousness like dominoes, falling in patterns too complex to follow. You could buy a house, not just any house, but houses, plural, in every city you'd ever wanted to visit. You could travel anywhere in the world, stay in hotels that cost more per night than you currently earned in a month, eat at restaurants where dinner required reservations made months in advance, and meals that were considered art forms rather than mere sustenance. But beyond the immediate fantasies of luxury and comfort, beyond the obvious relief of never again needing to check price tags or calculate whether you could afford something you wanted, a deeper realization began to settle into your awareness, like morning light gradually illuminating a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. This wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from the constraints that had shaped every major decision of your adult life. Freedom to pursue interests and passions that had been relegated to weekend hobbies because they couldn't pay the bills. Freedom to take risks and try experiments and explore possibilities that had previously been financially impossible. After the initial shock had given way to something approaching acceptance of this impossible new reality, when you had confirmed through multiple banking apps and phone calls to increasingly amazed customer service representatives that, yes, this was really your account, and yes, this was really your money, when the magnitude of your transformed circumstances had begun to settle into your consciousness like a new form of gravity that changed the weight and meaning of every choice you would ever make again. The first challenge that emerged was not what to do with unlimited resources, but who to become when all your previous limitations had suddenly evaporated like morning mist. The person you had been yesterday was someone who made decisions based on careful calculation of costs and benefits, who weighed every purchase against rent money and savings goals, who had learned to find satisfaction in small pleasures and modest achievements because larger dreams seemed impractical or impossible. That person's values and priorities had been shaped by scarcity, by the need to choose between competing desires, by the discipline required to delay gratification and work toward distant goals that might or might not prove achievable. But who were you when money was no longer a factor in any decision you would ever need to make? When every restaurant was affordable, every destination reachable, every product or service or experience available for purchase, without consideration of budget or saving or sacrifice. The questions that had always guided your choices: can I afford this? Is this worth the cost? Will this purchase prevent me from buying something else I need? Had become irrelevant overnight, leaving you to navigate decisions using criteria you had never needed to develop. The first purchases were tentative, experimental, almost apologetic in their modesty. You bought coffee from the expensive cafe you had always walked past because their prices seemed unreasonable for something you could make at home. You upgraded your phone to the latest model without waiting for your contract to expire or shopping for deals. You ordered groceries online without checking prices, adding items to your cart based purely on appeal rather than cost per unit or nutritional value per dollar spent. Each transaction felt surreal, like playing a video game where the money counter had glitched and started displaying impossible numbers. Your credit card worked exactly as it always had. The cashiers treated you no differently than they had before, but internally, you were processing each purchase as confirmation that your new reality was genuine rather than an elaborate dream or mistake that would be corrected by morning. The psychological adjustment was more challenging than you had anticipated. Friends and family members who learned about your windfall reacted with mixtures of excitement, disbelief, and barely concealed envy that transformed familiar relationships into complex negotiations around expectations, obligations, and the unspoken questions about how much of your fortune you would share and under what circumstances. Conversations that had once flowed naturally became awkward dances around the elephant of wealth that had entered every room you occupied. Some people began treating you differently before you had changed anything about your behavior or appearance, as if the money itself had transformed your personality or made you a different person worthy of special consideration or careful management. A few weeks into your new existence as a member of the world's most exclusive financial club, when the initial euphoria of unlimited purchasing power had begun to settle into something more complex and nuanced, when you had discovered that money could indeed buy happiness, But that happiness, it turned out, was far more complicated than you had previously understood. Something unexpected began to emerge from your relationship with wealth that no amount of fantasy or daydreaming had prepared you to anticipate. The abundance that had seemed like pure liberation began to create its own form of anxiety as you realized that unlimited options could be more overwhelming than comforting. Standing in a luxury car dealership where every vehicle was within your budget, you found yourself paralyzed by choice, unable to decide between options that differed primarily in features that had no practical impact on your actual transportation needs. The salesperson's eager attention and elaborate explanations of premium packages and custom modifications felt absurd when you could afford any combination they offered, making the decision feel arbitrary rather than meaningful. Travel planning became an exercise in decision fatigue as you browsed through accommodations that ranged from modest luxury to absurd opulence, all equally affordable, all offering experiences that promise to be memorable and transformative. The travel agent, who had been assigned to assist you, seemed genuinely excited by the unlimited budget, presenting options for private jets and exclusive resorts and custom itineraries that could include any experience that money could purchase. But without financial constraints to help narrow your choices, you found yourself struggling to identify what you actually wanted to do versus what seemed like something a billionaire should want to do. The social dynamics of extreme wealth proved even more challenging to navigate than the practical decisions about how to spend money. Invitations arrived for events and gatherings that you had never known existed, charity galas where the cost of admission exceeded your former annual income, private parties on yachts and in penthouses where casual conversations involved sums of money that still made your mind reel despite your own financial transformation. These gatherings were populated by people who had been wealthy for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to consider the cost of anything, who discussed expensive purchases and luxurious experiences with the same casual tone others might use to talk about the weather. You began to understand that wealth of this magnitude was not just about having money, but about learning to inhabit a completely different social and psychological environment where the rules and customs and expectations bore little resemblance to the world you had previously known. The ultra-wealthy spoke a language of possibilities and problems that were foreign to anyone who had ever worried about paying rent or choosing between competing necessities. And learning to navigate this new social landscape required developing fluency in concerns and opportunities that felt simultaneously thrilling and alienating. Your old friends began to treat you as a different person, sometimes seeking advice on investments and opportunities, as if wealth had automatically granted you financial wisdom, sometimes maintaining careful distance, as if your money might be contagious or transformative in ways they weren't prepared to handle. 3 months into your life as an accidental billionaire, when you had grown somewhat accustomed to the surreal experience of unlimited financial resources, but had not yet fully adapted to the psychological and social implications of extreme wealth, when you had purchased some of the material objects you had always wanted and discovered that ownership felt different from desire in ways both satisfying and surprisingly empty, something began to shift in your relationship with money that would prove more transformative than the original gift itself. You began to understand that the real power of wealth was not in what it allowed you to buy for yourself, but in what it enabled you to create and change in the world around you. The expensive cars and luxury vacations and designer clothes had provided temporary pleasure, but they had not fundamentally altered your sense of purpose or satisfaction in ways that felt sustainable or meaningful. The most expensive meal you had ever eaten was delicious, but no more memorable than sharing pizza with friends who couldn't afford anything fancier. The most luxurious hotel suite you had stayed in was comfortable, but no more restful than your own bedroom when you were truly tired. But when you began to explore what $1 billion could accomplish beyond personal consumption, when you started to research and understand the scale of problems that could be addressed and projects that could be funded with resources of this magnitude, your perspective on wealth began to transform from seeing it as a tool for acquiring experiences and objects to understanding it as a form of creative and social power that carried responsibility as well as privilege. $1 billion could fund complete university educations for thousands of students, eliminating debt that would otherwise constrain their career choices and life possibilities for decades. It could establish research programs focused on solving specific medical conditions that affected millions of people, but received inadequate attention because they were not sufficiently profitable for pharmaceutical companies to prioritize. It could create affordable housing developments in cities where essential workers could no longer afford to live, or fund environmental restoration projects that would benefit entire ecosystems for generations. The more you learned about problems that could be solved with sufficient funding, the more you began to understand that your accidental wealth came with an implicit invitation to participate in forms of impact and change that extended far beyond your individual life and consumption. You could fund artists and musicians and writers whose work might never reach audiences without financial support, enabling creativity that could enrich culture and human understanding in immeasurable ways. You could support innovative educators and social entrepreneurs whose ideas had the potential to transform communities but lacked the capital necessary to scale their efforts. The realization was both exhilarating and overwhelming. With unlimited financial resources came unlimited responsibility for choosing how those resources would be used, and every choice to fund one project meant choosing not to fund thousands of other equally worthy initiatives. You began to understand why many billionaires dedicated significant portions of their time and energy to philanthropy, not just as a way to give back to society, but as a way to find meaning and purpose in wealth that exceeded any individual's capacity for personal consumption. 6 months after receiving Elon Musk's unexpected gift, when you had begun to establish routines and systems for managing wealth of a magnitude that still occasionally surprised you when you remembered its full implications, when you had started to develop a personal philosophy about how to use money in ways that felt aligned with your values and sense of purpose, something remarkable began to emerge from your experience that would have been impossible to predict based on any previous tip you had ever had with financial resources. Money, you discovered, was not actually the limiting factor in most of the dreams and aspirations you had previously attributed to lack of funding. The novel you had always wanted to write, but claimed you couldn't afford to pursue because writing didn't pay bills, could now be written with unlimited financial support. But the actual obstacles to completing it turned out to be the same challenges that had always existed: finding the discipline to write consistently, developing the skills necessary to craft compelling narratives, and working through the emotional and psychological barriers that made creative expression difficult regardless of economic circumstances. The relationships you had always wanted to build with friends and family members were not significantly enhanced by your ability to pay for expensive dinners and elaborate vacations together. The conversations that mattered most, the moments of genuine connection and understanding and shared joy, happened just as readily over home-cooked meals and walks in local parks as they did in five-star restaurants and exotic destinations. Your ability to be present with people you cared about, to listen deeply and offer emotional support and share meaningful experiences was not improved by having unlimited financial resources to deploy in service of those relationships. The personal growth and learning you had always claimed to want but couldn't afford to pursue, therapy, education, travel that would expand your perspective, became easily accessible, but the actual work of developing emotional intelligence, acquiring new knowledge, and integrating different cultural perspectives required the same internal effort and commitment that it had always demanded. Money could remove external barriers to these experiences, but it could not substitute for the psychological and spiritual work that genuine development required. Most surprisingly, you discovered that having unlimited financial resources did not eliminate the ordinary challenges and dissatisfactions that had characterized your life before wealth. You still experienced days when you felt bored or restless or uncertain about your direction. You still had conflicts with people you cared about, still faced decisions that felt difficult and unclear, still struggled with questions about meaning and purpose that no amount of money could resolve through purchase or investment. The difference was that you no longer had the convenient excuse of financial limitation to explain why you weren't pursuing goals or making changes that felt important. When money was not a factor, you had to confront the reality that many of the obstacles to the life you wanted to live were internal rather than external, psychological rather than economic, matters of choice and commitment rather than resources and opportunity. This realization was both liberating and challenging, forcing you to take responsibility for your choices and outcomes in ways that had been easier to avoid when you could blame circumstances or lack of resources for the gap between your aspirations and your reality. A year into your unexpected journey as one of the world's wealthiest individuals, when you had learned to navigate the practical aspects of managing vast financial resources and had developed systems for making decisions about how to use money in ways that felt meaningful and responsible, when you had begun to understand that wealth of this magnitude was as much about psychological and social transformation as it was about material possibilities, something profound began to shift in your understanding of what it meant to live a fulfilling and purposeful life. The initial phase of your wealth experience had been dominated by experimentation and exploration, trying expensive experiences, acquiring luxury objects, and discovering what unlimited purchasing power could and could not provide in terms of satisfaction and happiness. The second phase had focused on learning how to use money as a tool for positive impact, funding projects, and supporting causes that could benefit others and contribute to solving problems that mattered to you. But this third phase involved a deeper recognition that your relationship with wealth was fundamentally a reflection of your relationship with yourself and your understanding of what made life meaningful, you began to realize that the most profound gift Elon Musk had given you was not actually the money itself, but the removal of financial constraints that had previously provided convenient explanations for why you weren't living the life you claimed to want. Without the excuse of limited resources, you were forced to confront more fundamental questions about who you were, what you valued, and how you wanted to contribute to the world during your brief time on this planet. The freedom that came with unlimited financial resources was not just the freedom to buy things or travel places or fund projects, but the freedom to choose how to spend your time and attention and energy based purely on what felt most meaningful and aligned with your deepest values. You could pursue relationships that enriched your life rather than those that served your career advancement. You could engage in work that felt purposeful rather than simply profitable. You could structure your days around activities that contributed to your growth and well-being rather than those that generated income to meet survival needs. This freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying because it eliminated the external structure and motivation that had previously organized your life around earning money to meet basic needs and working toward financial goals that had seemed important when they were difficult to achieve. Without the need to work for money, you had to discover what kinds of activities and contributions felt worthy of your time and energy when survival and security were no longer motivating factors. Many of your previous ambitions and dreams, when examined without the lens of financial limitation, turned out to be less important to you than you had imagined. Goals that had seemed compelling when they were financially out of reach became less interesting when they were easily achievable. You discovered that some of your desires had been more about proving your worth or achieving social status than about genuine interest in the experiences or objects themselves. But other aspirations, when freed from financial constraints, revealed themselves to be even more important and meaningful than you had realized, worth pursuing, not because they were difficult or expensive, but because they aligned with your authentic interests and values and sense of purpose. 18 months after receiving the gift that had transformed not just your bank account, but your entire relationship with possibility and limitation, when you had grown comfortable with the rhythms and responsibilities of extreme wealth while maintaining connection to the person you had been before money eliminated most of the practical constraints that had previously shaped your daily life, something unexpected began to emerge from your experience that surprised even you in its depth and implications for how you understood the nature of abundance and scarcity, generosity and receiving, individual prosperity and collective well-being. You began to discover that wealth of this magnitude created opportunities not just for philanthropy and charitable giving, but for experimenting with entirely different economic models and social structures that could demonstrate alternative ways of organizing communities around principles of mutual support and shared prosperity rather than competition and individual accumulation. With unlimited financial resources, you could fund projects that explored what became possible when basic needs were guaranteed for everyone involved, when people could pursue their interests and develop their talents without worrying about economic survival. You started small, with your immediate community of friends and family members, offering to eliminate their debts and provide ongoing financial support that would allow them to pursue education, creative projects, or career changes that had previously been financially impossible. But as you observed the transformations that occurred when people were freed from economic anxiety, you began to envision larger experiments in community organization and resource sharing that could serve as models for how society might function if wealth were distributed more equitably. You funded the creation of intentional communities where housing, food, healthcare, and education were provided as community resources rather than individual purchases, allowing residents to contribute their talents and energy toward collective projects and shared goals rather than spending most of their time earning money to pay for basic necessities. These communities became laboratories for exploring how humans might organize themselves when cooperation replaced competition as the primary economic strategy, when creativity and service replaced wage labor as the primary forms of meaningful work. The results were more remarkable than you had anticipated. People who had been stressed and exhausted by the demands of economic survival often experienced dramatic improvements in health, creativity, and emotional well-being when those pressures were removed. Children who grew up in environments where basic needs were guaranteed and adults were available to provide attention and guidance because they weren't preoccupied with earning money, developed in ways that seemed to unlock human potential that economic systems based on scarcity had been suppressing. Artists and inventors and social innovators who were freed from the need to make their creativity profitable in order to survive produced works and ideas that were more experimental, more socially beneficial, and more personally meaningful than what they had been able to create when they needed to appeal to market forces to generate income. Teachers and healers and community organizers who could focus entirely on serving others without worrying about their own financial security developed approaches and programs that were more effective and transformative than what was possible when their time and attention were divided between helping others and securing their own economic survival. 2 years into your extraordinary journey as an accidental member of the ultra-wealthy elite, when your initial amazement at having unlimited financial resources had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how money could be used as a tool for social transformation and community building, when you had begun to see yourself not as someone who had received an incredible gift, but as someone who had been entrusted with resources that carried responsibility for their wise and beneficial use, something began to shift in your perspective that connected your personal experience with larger questions about how society might evolve beyond economic systems based on artificial scarcity and competition for limited resources. The experiments in community building and alternative economic organization that you had been funding had begun to attract attention from researchers, social entrepreneurs, and policymakers who were interested in understanding what your projects revealed about human potential and social possibility when basic needs were guaranteed and people were free to pursue their authentic interests and contributions without economic coercion. Universities began to study your communities as examples of post-scarcity economics in action, documenting the changes in health, creativity, social cooperation, and environmental stewardship that emerged when people could organize their lives around values other than individual economic advancement. The data was compelling. Communities where resources were shared and basic needs were guaranteed for all members showed significantly lower rates of crime, mental illness, and social conflict than comparable populations operating under traditional economic systems. Environmental impact decreased dramatically when people could choose products and practices based on ecological considerations rather than cost, when transportation and housing could be organized for efficiency and sustainability rather than individual ownership and profit maximization. Most remarkably, productivity and innovation increased rather than decreased when people were freed from the need to work for survival, as community members pursued projects and developed skills based on genuine interest and social benefit rather than external rewards and punishments. The fear that guaranteed security would make people lazy and unmotivated proved unfounded. Instead, security seemed to unlock creativity and social engagement that had been suppressed by the stress and time demands of economic survival. You began to realize that your billion-dollar gift from Elon Musk had been not just a personal windfall, but a form of social experiment, an opportunity to explore what became possible when individuals had access to resources that allowed them to transcend the limitations and distortions that economic scarcity imposed on human development and community organization. Your experience was generating insights and demonstrating possibilities that could inform larger conversations about how society might evolve toward more equitable and sustainable forms of organization. The attention your projects were receiving also connected you with other wealthy individuals who were grappling with similar questions about how to use their resources in ways that contributed to positive social transformation rather than simply increasing their personal comfort and status. You discovered a growing movement of philanthropists and social entrepreneurs who were moving beyond traditional charity models toward more systemic approaches that addressed root causes of social problems rather than just their symptoms. 3 years after that life-changing message had appeared on your phone, when your identity had fully integrated the reality of unlimited financial resources with your evolving understanding of how wealth could serve not just personal desires, but collective well-being and social evolution, when you had become someone who thought naturally in terms of systemic impact and long-term community benefit rather than individual acquisition and consumption, something remarkable began to emerge from the network of projects and relationships and experimental communities that your resources had made possible. The alternative economic models you had been funding and developing had begun to replicate themselves organically with communities that had experienced the benefits of guaranteed basic needs and cooperative resource sharing, inspiring the creation of similar experiments in other locations and contexts. People who had participated in your projects were becoming leaders and organizers themselves, using the skills and insights they had developed to create new communities and initiatives that extended the principles of post-scarcity economics to broader populations and different geographical areas. What had started as your personal exploration of how to use wealth meaningfully had evolved into a movement that was demonstrating practical alternatives to economic systems that required poverty and insecurity for some in order to generate profit and luxury for others. Your $1 billion had become seed capital for a transformation that was spreading far beyond what any individual fortune could directly fund, creating social and economic innovations that were being adopted and adapted by communities around the world. The most significant development was the emergence of technologies and organizational structures that could extend the benefits of post-scarcity economics to populations that didn't have access to billionaire benefactors. The communities you had funded had developed systems for local resource sharing, cooperative decision-making, and sustainable production that could be implemented by groups with modest financial resources but strong social connections and shared commitment to mutual support. Open-source plans for efficient housing, food production, renewable energy systems, and communication networks had been developed and tested in your experimental communities, then made freely available to anyone who wanted to create similar projects in their own locations. Educational programs had been designed to teach the social and organizational skills necessary for cooperative community building, conflict resolution, and consensus decision-making that made these alternative economic models successful. The ripple effects extended far beyond the communities that directly participated in these experiments. Policy researchers were documenting the social and environmental benefits of guaranteed basic security and cooperative resource management, influencing political conversations about universal basic income, community land trusts, and other systemic approaches to reducing inequality and increasing social resilience. Business leaders were exploring how principles of cooperation and shared prosperity could be integrated into corporate structures and practices in ways that served both profitability and social benefit. Most personally meaningful to you was the recognition that your role had evolved from someone who had received an extraordinary gift to someone who had learned to serve as a facilitator and catalyst for social transformation that extended far beyond what any individual could achieve alone, regardless of their financial resources. 5 years after Elon Musk's unexpected message had redirected the entire trajectory of your life, when the initial disbelief and excitement and confusion had long since settled into a mature understanding of wealth as both opportunity and responsibility, when you had learned to navigate the complex landscape of extreme privilege while maintaining connection to your essential values and sense of purpose, when the projects and communities and relationships you had built with your resources had begun to generate their own momentum and impact that extended far beyond your direct involvement, something profound began to crystallize in your awareness about the nature of abundance and the possibilities inherent in human cooperation and creativity. When basic needs are secured and people are free to contribute their authentic gifts to collective well-being, the transformation in your own life had been remarkable, but it paled in comparison to the changes you had witnessed in the lives of thousands of people who had been touched by the projects and communities your resources had made possible. You had seen individuals who had been trapped in cycles of poverty and stress blossom into creativity and leadership when their basic needs were guaranteed and they were surrounded by supportive community. You had watched children who grew up in environments of security and cooperation develop emotional intelligence and social skills that seemed to represent the next stage of human evolution. But perhaps most significantly, you had learned that the real power of wealth was not in what it could purchase, but in what it could demonstrate about human potential and social possibility. Your $1 billion had served as proof of concept for economic and social arrangements that could theoretically be implemented by any community willing to prioritize cooperation over competition, shared prosperity over individual accumulation, long-term sustainability over short-term profit. The communities you had funded had become living examples of what was possible when humans organized themselves around principles of mutual care and collective creativity rather than scarcity and competition. They had developed technologies, social practices, and organizational structures that could be replicated and adapted by groups with very different financial resources, creating a template for social transformation that was not dependent on billionaire philanthropy, but could be implemented by any community committed to the values and practices that made such transformation possible. Your personal journey from ordinary person worried about paying bills to accidental billionaire, grappling with the implications of extreme wealth, had taught you that money was ultimately just a tool, powerful but limited in its capacity to create the experiences and relationships and sense of purpose that made life meaningful. The most valuable aspects of your transformed existence, the deeper connections with friends and family, the satisfaction of contributing to projects that mattered, the sense of alignment between your values and your daily activities, were available to anyone willing to prioritize them, regardless of their financial circumstances. The $1 billion had removed external barriers and provided opportunities to experiment with alternatives, but the actual work of creating meaningful relationships, purposeful activities, and positive impact required the same internal resources of creativity, commitment, and genuine care for others that had always been available to you and to everyone else, independent of financial status. 7 years after that transformative message had appeared on your phone, when your experience as an accidental billionaire had taught you more about human nature and social possibility than any formal education could have provided, when the communities and projects and relationships you had built with unlimited financial resources had become self-sustaining ecosystems of cooperation and creativity that continued to evolve and expand beyond your direct involvement, when you had learned to see yourself not as the owner of vast wealth, but as a temporary steward of resources that belonged ultimately to the collective human project of creating a more just and sustainable world, something began to emerge from your long contemplation of money and meaning that would have surprised the person you had been before receiving Elon Musk's gift. You realized that the most profound transformation in your life had not been gaining access to unlimited financial resources, but learning to see abundance as the natural state of a universe that provided everything necessary for all life to flourish. When intelligent beings learned to cooperate rather than compete, to share rather than hoard, to create rather than consume, the artificial scarcity that characterized most economic systems was not a reflection of limited resources, but of limited imagination about how resources could be organized and distributed to serve the well-being of all rather than the luxury of few. Your $1 billion had served as a temporary exemption from artificial scarcity, allowing you to experiment with what became possible when basic needs were guaranteed and people were free to pursue their authentic interests and contributions without economic coercion. But the insights and models and relationships that had emerged from those experiments were not dependent on continued access to vast financial resources. They were expressions of human capacity for cooperation and creativity that could be activated in any context where people were willing to prioritize collective well-being over individual advantage. The communities you had helped create were thriving not because they had ongoing access to your money, but because they had learned to organize themselves around principles of mutual support and shared resources that generated abundance through cooperation rather than requiring wealth transfer from external sources. They had developed local economies based on gift and reciprocity rather than market exchange, educational systems based on mentorship and collaborative learning rather than competitive credentialing, governance structures based on consensus and collective wisdom rather than hierarchical authority. Most remarkably, these communities were attracting new members, not because of material benefits, but because of the quality of life they offered: deeper relationships, meaningful work, connection to place and natural systems, participation in decisions that affected their daily lives, and the satisfaction that came from contributing to something larger than individual success. People were choosing to join these experiments in cooperative living not because they were financially desperate, but because they were spiritually and emotionally hungry for forms of community and purpose that mainstream society had failed to provide. You began to understand that your role had evolved from using money to solve problems to using money to demonstrate that most problems attributed to lack of resources were actually problems of organization, imagination, and priority. The projects you had funded were not primarily about spending money, but about investing time and attention and creativity in building relationships and systems that could generate well-being and sustainability through cooperation rather than requiring constant infusion of external resources. A decade after receiving the gift that had launched your journey into the complexities and possibilities of extreme wealth, when you had grown into someone who understood money as one tool among many for creating positive change in the world, when the initial excitement and anxiety of unlimited financial resources had matured into a sophisticated practice of using wealth in service of collective flourishing rather than individual consumption, when the projects and communities and relationships you had nurtured with your resources had become part of a global movement toward more equitable and sustainable forms of human organization, something profound began to shift in your understanding of what Elon Musk had really given you when he transferred that $1 billion to your account. The money had been the obvious gift, the dramatic change in your material circumstances that had captured your attention and imagination and launched you into explorations of luxury and philanthropy and social experimentation that would have been impossible with ordinary financial resources. But the deeper gift had been the opportunity to discover what you were capable of when external limitations were removed, who you became when you were free to choose how to spend your time and energy based on values and interests rather than survival necessities. You had learned that most people, when freed from economic anxiety and given access to supportive community, revealed capacities for creativity, leadership, and contribution that remained hidden as long as they were focused on individual survival in competitive economic systems. The communities you had funded had become laboratories for human potential, demonstrating what individuals and groups could achieve when their basic needs were secured, and they were surrounded by others who supported their growth and celebrated their gifts. But perhaps the most significant insight from your decade of wealth stewardship was the recognition that abundance was not something that could be purchased or distributed, but something that emerged naturally from relationships and systems organized around principles of cooperation, sustainability, and mutual care. The $1 billion had provided temporary access to artificial abundance created by economic systems that concentrated resources through competition and exploitation. But the lasting abundance you had discovered was the natural result of communities learning to share resources efficiently and create wealth through collaborative effort rather than individual accumulation. The experimental communities you had funded were generating more prosperity, creativity, and well-being per dollar invested than any luxury purchase or traditional charitable donation you had ever made. Not because they were more expensive, but because they were more intelligent in their organization and more aligned with human, psychological, and social needs. They had learned to create abundance through cooperation, rather than requiring abundance to enable cooperation. This realization had led you to begin shifting your approach from using money to fund projects toward using money to teach and demonstrate principles of organization that could generate sustainable abundance in any context. Instead of being a source of ongoing financial support, you had become a catalyst for communities learning to create their own prosperity through cooperative effort and intelligent resource management. The most rewarding aspect of this evolution was watching communities develop confidence in their own capacity to create the conditions for flourishing without dependence on external funding or wealthy benefactors, taking ownership of their experiments in cooperative living and becoming teachers and inspirations for other groups seeking alternatives to competitive individualism. 15 years after that message from Elon Musk had redirected your life toward possibilities you could never have imagined when you were worried about ordinary bills and modest dreams, when your journey through the landscape of extreme wealth had taught you that money was simultaneously more powerful and more limited than you had ever understood, when the communities and movements and transformation you had catalyzed with your resources had grown far beyond what any individual fortune could have created or sustained. Something beautiful began to crystallize in your awareness about the true nature of the gift you had received and the gift you had learned to give. You realized that Elon Musk had not simply transferred money to your account. He had initiated you into an understanding of abundance that transcended financial resources, teaching you through direct experience that scarcity was largely an illusion maintained by systems that artificially limited access to the resources and opportunities that were naturally available when humans learned to cooperate intelligently. Your $1 billion had served as training wheels for learning to recognize and create abundance through relationship and creativity and shared purpose, preparing you to help others discover these capacities without requiring access to vast financial resources. The communities you had helped establish were now teaching these principles to new groups around the world, sharing not money, but knowledge and inspiration and practical models for creating prosperity through cooperation. The most successful projects were those that had learned to generate their own abundance through local resource sharing, skill development, and economic arrangements that served collective well-being while honoring individual creativity and autonomy. Your role had evolved from philanthropist to educator, from someone who solved problems with money to someone who helped others discover their own capacity to create solutions through collaboration and mutual support. The workshops and conferences and publications you now funded were designed not to create dependence on your resources, but to build confidence and competence in communities that were learning to organize themselves around principles of abundance and cooperation. The greatest satisfaction came from witnessing communities that had started with your financial support, eventually graduating to complete self-sufficiency, becoming models and teachers themselves for other groups seeking alternatives to competitive individualism and artificial scarcity. Your money had served as temporary scaffolding that could be removed once communities had learned to support themselves through their own cooperative efforts. Looking back on 15 years of exploring what became possible when external limitations were removed, you understood that Elon Musk had given you the opportunity to discover that true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in the quality of relationships, the meaningfulness of work, the health of communities, and the sustainability of the systems that supported all life. The $1 billion had been a tool for learning to recognize and create these forms of wealth, which were available to anyone willing to prioritize cooperation over competition, sharing over hoarding, long-term flourishing over short-term advantage. The most profound realization was that abundance was humanity's natural inheritance, temporarily obscured by systems that artificially created scarcity to maintain control and generate profit, but always available to communities willing to remember their fundamental interconnection and organize their lives around principles of mutual care and shared prosperity. And so, we reach the gentle conclusion of this meditation on wealth and purpose, this exploration of what might unfold when unlimited financial resources meet human consciousness committed to using those resources in service of collective flourishing rather than individual consumption. When the dream of having enough money transforms into the deeper question of what constitutes a life well lived and how individual abundance can serve the well-being of all. In this alternative reality, where a famous entrepreneur's generosity launched one ordinary person into extraordinary circumstances, we witness the transformation not just of bank balances, but of understanding about the nature of wealth, security, and human potential. The $1 billion revealed itself to be less important than the freedom it provided to explore what became possible when survival needs were secured and people could organize their lives around values and relationships rather than economic necessities. Perhaps most beautifully, this journey demonstrated that the capacity for creating abundance through cooperation and creativity was not dependent on access to vast financial resources, but was a natural human ability that could be activated by anyone willing to prioritize community well-being over individual advancement. The experimental communities funded by the original gift became proof that prosperity could emerge from intelligent organization and mutual support rather than requiring wealth accumulation and competitive advantage. The person who had once worried about paying bills and wondered what they might accomplish with unlimited resources discovered that the most meaningful uses of wealth were those that helped others discover their own capacity for creativity, leadership, and contribution to collective flourishing. Money had served as a temporary tool for learning to recognize and create forms of abundance that transcended financial measurement, the abundance of meaningful relationships, purposeful work, healthy communities, and sustainable systems that supported all life. As we drift toward sleep, carrying this vision of wealth transformed into wisdom, of individual good fortune channeled into collective benefit, we might remember that each of us carries resources more valuable than money: creativity, compassion, the ability to form relationships, the capacity to envision and work toward better ways of organizing human communities. around principles of mutual care and shared prosperity. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will experience what it feels like to live in communities where everyone's basic needs are secured, where work feels like play because it serves purposes that matter, where creativity flourishes because it doesn't need to be profitable to be valued, where relationships deepen because they're not constrained by economic competition and status anxiety. Perhaps you will wake tomorrow with the memory of how abundance feels when it's shared rather than hoarded, when it emerges from cooperation rather than competition, when it serves the flourishing of all rather than the luxury of few. And perhaps, in carrying that memory into your daily activities, you will become one of the abundance creators, one of the cooperation builders, one of those who help demonstrate that true wealth lies not in what we can accumulate for ourselves, but in what we can create together for the benefit of all. The $1 billion continue to multiply in every act of generosity, every choice to cooperate rather than compete, every moment when individual resources serve collective flourishing, creating forms of wealth that no bank account could ever contain. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll dream of receiving not just money, but the wisdom to use any resources, time, skills, creativity, love, in service of collective flourishing. Perhaps you'll wake knowing that true abundance comes from what we share, not what we hoard. Sweet dreams, generous soul. Like if you believe wealth should serve everyone, subscribe for more visions of shared prosperity.